Now, this one sounds almost unbelievable for those who have not been following, but it is true and very deeply troubling. An 18-year-old apprentice in Ogun State has reportedly impregnated 10 girls within a span of 5 months. Yes, you heard that right, 10 girls. The story, which quickly made rounds online, has reignited debates around teen sexuality, moral values, community accountability, and the glaring gaps in sex education and parenting.
But the question is, how did we get here? Is this just an isolated scandal, or does it reveal a broader moral breakdown in our society, or worse, a systemic failure in raising and protecting our young people, particularly the boys? So joining us to explore these critical issues are two guests. But first, and they're coming from different faith and family perspectives. But here in the studio, we're going to get started with Mr. Tolu Awobiyi, is the head of Unit Marriage Enrichment, the Covenant Nation. Tolu, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. A very saddening story. An 18-year-old boy. It begs to ask the question: was attending sex education classes when he was, what, 13, 14? Does he not know the anatomy, I beg your pardon, of his body and what it means when he gets to that point for the other girl? Also, 10 children in 5 months. Is he trying to be, Father Abraham, or I don't know? There's just so much that it rides on your head. But more importantly is, when you heard this story, what stuck out to you first?
Well, what jumps out immediately is who are the parents of both the boy and the girls who have been laid to in the way of pregnancy. And it boils back to the heart of society. We say that the heart of society is the home. Where are you coming from? What's your orientation? What kind of learning did you have when you were growing up? Again, we've come into a world where people think that we should just throw things up in the air, make no rules, and find out what the outcome is. This is the outcome of throwing things into the air. Now, I remember that when I served, I served in Jos, interestingly. There was a particular young man who came to fix he came to do some carpentry work for me. And this boy is about 17, and at 7 a.m. in the morning, he's drunk, right? And so while he's, going through this conversation, I engage him and tell him, what's going on with you? And, I start to, probe him, and I find out that this boy has about maybe 12 kids.
At 17?
At 17. I'm like, what's going on with you? How is that even possible? He's like, I'm just having sex. Like, I didn't go to school. I now have a job. I can make some money. I can give the girls some money. I buy her a plate of food. She's ready to lie down. I sleep with her. I don't remember I slept with her. 9 months later, there's a baby. And
I don't remember I slept with her.
I don't remember I slept with her. And you see, because we live in Lagos and in, society, we think that that's how the world is. Outside Lagos, just outside Ogun State, thank God this is a story just in Abeokuta, right? You see that the life they live there is completely different from the life we're living here. There's such abject poverty. And when we talk about poverty, we're not talking about money. We're talking about even education, exposure, understanding of how life is supposed to be. Now, I'm going to take us on a quick run back. How did society govern itself before we came into this modernity that we have? Right, let's do a flashback. My grandma told me a story. I'm sorry, I'm a storyteller. I make movies for a living. Yes. My grandma said, I asked her, how did you get married to somebody who's almost 40, 50 years older than you? Because she was the last wife of 6 women. And she said, I was born a princess, right? But age 17, one day my dad tells me I should follow his, one of his, men, orderlies that they will be right now. And they took her to the house of a wealthy man for all of her property, sat her there, put a keg of water in front of her and said, sit here, stay here until the owner of this house returns from wherever he's coming When he comes back, tell him that the king says, you are now married to this child. And, you know, he hit me like, what is going on?
Does that still happen today? Because, I mean, that's a couple of years ago.
This is, I hope this is not an example.
Okay, let's not deviate it because we are time constrained for conversations like this. And I'd like you to speak on, you talk about the life that we have here and the life that is in other places. It might not be the same. And we're hearing this story because somebody came out. And because the person was at a loss at what actions to take to seek a response. Is this more a systemic failure? Because I do know that growing up, even while I was just out of secondary school, I used to do adult classes, teach adults how to read and write, you know, but without the basic education, even those that are adults should get the opportunity to learn. So is it a failure, systemic failure of all of us? And how do we go about repairing? You also talked about the home. I have a little concern about that because the family dynamics is different. And the society, however we want to look at it, it cannot be, you know, a smooth plane. There has to be, ups and downs, different levels of living and conditions and all of that. Take that on.
So again, you know, I feel like we over-prioritize what we think is our intellectual powers. Before we came up with all this intelligence and all these educational systems and all these things that we had, how did we govern ourselves, right?
Fair question.
Now, whether we like it or not, Africa existed before the colonialism, where we then introduced this education, which unfortunately...
No, but that might be a bit of a contradiction of what you just said, because in time past, your grandmother was taken. So if that kind of governance existed then, if it is in today's society, the whole nation will be in uproar.
Right.
There might be some dynamics
here. But there's a difference here, right? The mother, whoever this young lady is, your grandmother, whoever it was taken and said, this is your husband. And so there was some sort of Puritan approach to it in terms of you are not philandering, right? Or you're not experimenting sex. And the only time you can experiment. And so that's what I think that's what I was trying to say in terms of,
because I then asked her, I said, why would he do this? It feels so, you know, just random and, evil, as far as I'm concerned. And she then explained to me that it wasn't evil. In retrospect, now that she was much older, she understood that because she was the daughter of a king, right? She didn't want, it was rampant then that a man would just see a fine girl, jump on her, get her pregnant. Same thing happening, right? And so the king, to protect her, made her a married woman.
At 17. That's another layer.
So exactly, that's another layer. So when you see in the north, you see there's this thing going on where, you marry off a 13-year-old, and like, why would you do that? There was a reason. Now, I'm Christian, and I do not subscribe to any of that such behavior. But if you understood how the home unit became the society unit, right? You saw the connection between it. You begin to understand, oh, this was how, we protected ourselves when there was no systemic protection. How do you ensure that the girl does not end up, abused severally? She needs to have a covering. She's in your house as a child. After some time, she must go into motherhood or into, wifehood or whatever that is. So back in the day, they would take, oh, I want my daughter to be your wife. It seemed like it was control, but what they were doing was protecting the society so that you don't have a lot of girls that are getting
So we need to evolve new ways.
Now, for the world to evolve, you must understand where you're coming from. Now, a lot of the people, we in Lagos know that there's some rules that we live by. But the guy who's living in the, village, his father's giving birth to him, doesn't take care of him. The day he starts to make some money, he wants to sleep with someone. We need to also understand those systems and understand, okay, how do we help those systems? One of the ways you're mentioning is educating them, helping them understand the consequence. Like I said, this young man I met who says, I didn't even remember sleeping with her, right? It's 9 months ago, right? He's living his life on the nose. Society has to find a way to govern itself, whether it's informal or in a formal way. And that's what we used to have in the old days. We had kings, we had rules, you can't touch this, you can't do that, and that's why it seemed like, why are all these rules there?
Right. I always come from the child psychology, behavioral, psychology point of view, right? And I'm looking at the ages of these children.
Correct.
So the boy is 18,
yes,
right? And we don't know if he just clocked 18 or is 18. And we only know of the 10 young girls because of this report. And that means there's a history there of promiscuity, right? And we don't also know about the girls themselves, you know, what their ages as well as if they have been experimenting or they have been, you know, quite lax. I don't want to use promiscuity when it comes to young girls and women, right? But they have been experimenting and having multiple sexual partners. And so there's two things that stand out for me here. One, the prefrontal lobe of the brain of the young pre-teenage child, where the rush for them to want to experiment and try, and they're getting used to their body and they're excited to do it. There's one, right? So that intersection of that. And then two, social media that forces them, I mean, I may not even force, but like compel them, you know, the peer pressure to want to try. And so I want you to talk about that and how, you know, parents watching at home can be able to see those signs and be able to sit down and talk to them and be like, I know you feel the impulse.
Correct.
But it's not okay.
So I say this to you, first of all. Again, I come back to the fact that the family unit is the most responsible party. Now, a lot of times we want to push this into the government, right? And the government is supposed to provide the climate, the atmosphere, the environmental support for whatever is going on in the family unit. Now, if the family unit fails, what happens when a child is going through that, you know, that experience? A parent who has experienced it before is supposed to be present to guide the child. Now, where there's an absence of parenting, we then end up with all this, the default behavior. You know, basically people just trying out things, right? Which is why we must consciously transfer right values, not the wrong values, the right values, and we continue to iterate our values. You know, not that we keep all those olden days rules, but we must consciously transfer the right values from this generation to the next, because eventually a young boy who's sleeping around and having so many children will pay for it in the long run.
And not just children, multiple sexual partners as well, because
there's
STIs, there's
exactly
STDs, they're not.
I think that that takes me to something I was thinking as you were talking, and that is sexual health education.
Correct.
When is the right time? Because different dynamics, educated parents, non-educated parents, different cultural background, orientation, and all of that. What should be the minimum age where parents can begin to raise the conversation about sexual education for
as a parent myself? I started to speak to my kids pretty much as early as 5, and again, it's incremental information.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, you basically can't talk about everything at the beginning,
once, yeah.
But you make them first conscious of their bodies. There's some places that are private. There's some places that are open. So a handshake is a public exchange of, you know, affinity.
Yeah.
However, once the handshake begins to get beyond your elbow, it becomes something else. And kids are vulnerable, right? I remember once counseling a particular young lady who had been raped from the age of 3 to 11. Because her grandma used to leave her with this uncle in the same building. You can imagine the extent of trauma she's experienced, right? And so, again, can your teacher in school protect the child? No. It comes down to daddy and mommy. That responsibility to educate the child.
Well, there are some children who don't have parents. They don't have father, they don't have mother, they have guardians. There are also young teenagers in orphanages.
Correct.
So I'm just asking, beyond parents, for those, I mean, it is a basic right here in Nigeria that children should be educated. Even the Almajiris are getting some level of education. So how do we begin to fit this in? What is the appropriate time? And what, I really don't know where to begin to ask this question.
See, again, I like the elements of system that we need to bring into it, but system must come off community, right? So where there's no parents, there were parents before that parents. There were brothers and siblings around that
communities
parents.
where
community
is also
raising children. Which is where, you know, the idea that, oh, it's my kids, don't talk to them.
It's always
is absolutely wrong. We need to bring back those values. Where I remember when we used to play as kids those days, everybody feared my dad, right? Why? Because First thing is my dad is coming, we're off,
Flying
back home. He's coming back, and all the other kids are flying back home. Why? Because I remember one particular day he was walking down, and of course we were playing football, and we had disappeared, and there were two of us, so the team had become imbalanced. So the rest were now sitting down grumpily on the floor. And my dad was walking past, and he had spotted us, but he just figured out, And then he looks at these kids, and he's thinking, if I'm going to flog my kids, then these kids also deserve, something.
So everyone
and he stands and sees one of them and says to him, "Why are you sitting down there on the ground with the shorts that your parents bought for you?" And I'm like, "Daddy, that's not your business." But immediately everybody becomes conscious, and at that time, nobody dares enough to disrespect him. In today's generation, you speak to another man shout, you hear, what's your problem? Why do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so as we dismantle, the traditional systems of home, community, and then society, we dismantle the very fabric of
our
what protects
values
us.
and tenets.
Okay.
I have to ask you, right, from the church perspective,
Yes.
and the church champions abstinence in its entirety. But social media, the proliferation of, and see, look, I am an advocate of deleting the internet immediately.
I agree.
Listen, there's a red button, press it, let's
Let's down.
That is a complex conversation.
That is a mission impossible type scenario.
I want it done immediately because
never happening.
Unfortunately,
right.
we have
She's
AI,
right?
And so let's talk about what the church is dealing with, and by extension the family and society in terms of the democratization of the internet and how it is now given access to our youth. I'm not even talking about our children, our youth, to pornography, right?
Correct.
The music as well, the pictures. I will just be randomly scrolling on social media, and what do I see?
You get jumped by these things.
It is insane.
As an adult.
And the ones that send me the pictures, don't make me start reeling out your names. You know what I mean?
Just to add to what you're saying, the truth is, it is our reality today. In spite of it, despite it, rather, we still have children who come out really good, even in the face of these proliferation. So I think it's more of, like she was talking about, what the church is doing and how we can, despite our current reality, still mold children who are morally sound.
But first, abstinence.
So a number of issues have come up here. The first thing is we must have moral rules. A lot of people don't want to hear this, and that's what the church is supposed to stand for. A place where we say certain things should not happen, certain things they were supposed to represent moral consciousness. Now, in fairness, and I'll be honest with you, the church may be failing in that area. Again, it all still boils down to the fact that we've liberalized everything. Now, I'm not one of those I'm not a conservative who says, no, we should not have any liberality and everything should be controlled and governed. However, with our freedom must come responsibility. And so, for me, the more we have churches, the more we should have proper moral guidance. But what church does is basically a support to whatever society is choosing as law. The church cannot override what is law, right? So while let's say...
We must separate the state and the church.
Yes, the church is here. It will eventually echo what's being spoken. Let me give you a simple example. In America, they say abortion is legal, right? Which then means all these young girls that are, popping, if you're in America, somebody will be removing it per second billing. Now, whether that is right or wrong, it's dependent on the government that defines it for you. Luckily for us, our government still frowns at it, and so we're not going all out and encouraging it. Now, if the government says we want abortion, the church would have to either say clearly that I'm going to go up against government, or, take a following stand.
Okay, so we have a diverse audience, and our audience include agnostics, Muslims, non-religious people, and all of that. So the prison that you're coming from in the Christendom will resonate more with those who have that faith. Let's look at something that hasn't been touched so far in this conversation, and that's the apprentice system. It's one of those things that came from the past to the present and continues to permeate. So is there perhaps a way we can tweak the system and get those who are having this apprentice have some sort of responsibility?
But they always have.
Where the parents,
They've always had.
no, where the parents are failing in terms of sexual education for these apprentices. So this young man was staying with someone, for instance. Is it possible for us to evolve a system where they will have some role? If this person is under your roof, you should educate.
So I would say there's primary education and then secondary education. Let's say your primary education is from your home. It's what you've absorbed as your primary education that you will take into your secondary education. So let's imagine a child is properly brought up at home, then gets to an environment where there's an apprentice, system. And maybe, for example, let's say the leader or the owner of the business where he's running his apprenticeship is a promiscuous person, right? And he's exposed to this promiscuous person. What is society supposed to guide you to do? That child should go back home and give feedback. So, for example, my kids go to school. I expect them to come and tell me, Daddy, I'm in school. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. And I tell you, you can't change what's happening in school. However, you can choose what to do, right? So once we understand that this is how this, because you can't eradicate evil.
All right. I don't know if there's a science to this, but I do have a theory, right? Poverty and...
Correct.
Poverty and sex,
yes,
they go hand in hand. I think it's an entertainment for the lack of wealth. I don't know what it is, right?
It's distraction.
So it's past distraction and now entertainment, right? Yes. And listen, apprentice, and just you saying apprentice just took me back to, back in the day. I've always said that I didn't grow up in a privileged background, so I was honored and blessed to have witnessed a number of things growing up. And one of them is the mechanic shop, the vulcanizer shop, the carpentry shop,
correct,
and the metal workshop. The things that go on in those areas are bizarre and wild.
Bizarre.
And so how then can, not the church this time, right? And maybe not the government, but maybe NGOs and civil societies be able to educate that sect, that part of the society that is often not looked at.
So the truth is, how do we, it starts like a message. You have an idea. We have this conversation right now. How do we spread this message, right? The message that what's going on is wrong, right? Starts at the heart of understanding that to put a message out, before I share with you, I have to come to a point where I believe it. And then I share with you, and then you share with others. Because in the end, you talk to an NGO, right? And I've spoken to several NGOs about, conversations like, child education, especially female, and you would only catch, maybe an NGO does 5,000 kids, 10,000 kids. It has to become something that we build into how we orient ourselves, which is why it's important that we don't damage our culture, right? I love what you talked about when you were talking about the internet and how that is eroding our value system.
Yeah.
Where important things that, I told someone, I said, for the first time I went to America, I was expecting to see naked people everywhere.
And you'll be surprised.
So that TV thing that we're looking at is showing us the worst of them. And the churches in Texas are more than the churches in Lagos. Like, I'm like, wait, am I in Redeeming City? What's going on?
Yeah.
There's this church, that church, Methodist church, everywhere, right? We assume that the average American, right, is a derelict. It's not true. So we have, for example, I remember once I was telling my kids, I said, Will Smith said he, as, funny as his character is, he says he doesn't allow his kids use the F word. So
and he doesn't swear in his songs.
Yes, and I told my kids, I said, see, so that your friends are doing it does not make it right. And it still boils down to this individual element of taking something, believing it's right, and spreading the message.
Okay, I'm just thinking out of the box. We have community health centers. We have, festivals. We just talked about the
Ojudeoba
Festival. We know that There are even, my colleague went to Benue, I think, not too long ago,
blessings
for the virgin emergence and all of that. Is it possible for us to waive conversation around sexual health? Events like this,
agree.
even in maybe in churches as well, when you have the Sunday service, and in Islamic classes, is it possible?
So I'll give you a simple example. Recently in church, I just, I reached out to the pastor and I said, Pastor, I have a nudging in me to have a conversation with our teenagers. And he was like, what's this? I said, I want to talk to them about sex. I wrote a book called What's the Big Deal About Sex for teenagers, right? Because I feel like, you see, when these kids don't have this information early enough, and it's not just the responsibility of the church. We should do it in schools, we should do it online, we should do it in movies, because this is what is determining how people are making their moral choices. It has to become a conscious thing that we bring back moral instruction. When we were growing up, there was literally a class in secondary school, in primary school, that was moral instruction. I had a note where this is how to behave, this is what to do, this is what to say. Now, in some societies, it's a big deal. You go to the Japanese. They have morals first before everything else, right? But because we've exalted money as the new god in our system, fame and fanciful things are the things that we use to determine I can do anything as long as I'm getting famous. The idea of even the Yahoo system that we have currently comes from me. I don't care how I make money as long as I have money.
Again, we're talking of the possibility of incorporating a sexual education, but we cannot take the current economic realities out of the equation. You just oppose the poverty and this exploitation of sex and young people. Young girls, when it's too early, or perhaps contraceptive education, because the reality is, I like to be practical. You cannot stop these young people from experimenting, whether we really want to or not. We cannot stop them. So is it practical to also include contraceptive education for both the young girls and the boys who are engaging in this act?
The government must do its part. But if I was going to ask you, would you have me as a teacher teach your daughter contraceptive education?
Yes, absolutely.
Hold on a second.
Yes. Because
again, this is you trusting me to behave myself around the child, right? I'm focused a lot on the primary education. The best person, best person to teach my daughter about contraceptives and stuff should be her mother, who experienced it first. Then what she's taught, she then must now be amplified in a proper education.
So let me now shock you. My mom is a primary school teacher.
Excellent.
A retired primary school teacher. And you would expect that she would know. But she was a bit uncomfortable. I still remember my conversation about menstrual cycle with my mother. She was very uncomfortable about talking about it. And I had to be the one to say, Mama,
I need to understand what's going on.
I will get the rest of the information. I later was now schooling my mother on some of these issues. If you look at it, sometimes it is not easy. You're looking at the child you birthed. Right?
It is not that conversation.
Exactly. It is not easy to have these conversations. So,
should the mechanic do it?
No. Let's because we're almost out of time, I really wanted to talk about the young ladies, right? And we don't, like I said, there are no details as to who these 10 girls are. And from what's clear, from my own understanding, it feels like if this boy is 18 and he's done this in 5 months, what more has he done in the past, right? And how long has he left a trail of destruction and babies on his track, right? And so, but most importantly for the young girls, right? This is a precarious time to raise a girl child.
Correct.
It is a hard time and a difficult time. And with the economic indices, it's even extra harder because when you go on social media, you see the weaves and when they tune in and they see you, it's all glamour and everyone aspires to that, right? And so when you have somebody who's an 18-year-old apprenticeship, chances are he's getting money under the table and he's giving this young girls. I mean, like I said, I come from a background, so I know these things. And so how can mothers and fathers
Very important.
hold their daughters. Because as much as we can talk here, you cannot follow the child everywhere.
You can't.
You know, so what can you do for the teenage girl at this time, given all that is happening in
I say, as a parent, be present. As old as we are, as confident as we are, none of us will sleep with our husbands or wives in the presence of our parents. There is something about the role of the father and the mother, right? And that role was given to you as a responsibility, right? You said you spoke about your mom. Of course, I had the same issues with my, parents. My dad never told me some of the things I'm experiencing now. Like, so this is what my dad was going through, right? And that's what we must change in our generation. These conversations have to be had.
Yeah.
These conversations have to be had, and they have to be had at every level.
Most importantly, everyone be present. The parents be present. The NGOs and the CSOs must come together. The church and society must work hand in hand. Tolu, Awobiyi, I must say thank you for taking the time to come.